Hello and welcome to my Tableau Vivant presentation for Part B. I'm Lauren and I'll be taking you through this today. First of all, we'll go over a contextual background, just a review of that. So after investigating in Part A several stylistic movements, I decided for my final Tableau Vivant to represent the Goth subculture originating in the United Kingdom during the period of the 1980s, so that particular decade. So first of all, to go over the 1980s. So it was an age of both civil unrest, but also conversely personal liberation and prosperity. So at the time, you had a counter shift happening, going against what was called the post-war consensus. So the war ended in maybe 20 years prior, so it was still fresh in the public consciousness, but enough time had passed, I guess, that people were starting to move away from the concept of post-war consensus, which pretty much means when the two political parties, they decided to put aside the differences and facilitate policies that would help build up the country, I guess, in the post-war period. And let it become strong again. So you had a very strong welfare state and very heavy government regulation. So people started getting tired of that, especially because that resulted in a huge amount of inflation. So prices went up and you had like a massive recession going on. So as a result of people going against that publicly, you had growing support for the Conservative Party. And in 1979, the Iron Lady, as she was known, Margaret Thatcher, she was elected as Prime Minister, and with her she brought very harsh, hardline fiscal policies to try and turn that inflation around, and harsher rhetoric. So the concepts of crime, poverty and drugs, it was very black and white and us versus them in tone. So collectively all of these policies, they were known as Thatcherism. So at the time, you had mass unemployment happening, riots in the streets, and workers' protests and strikes. Urban decay was rampant. So you had all these people moving into the city, all of them unemployed. That's kind of basically what urban decay is. It's just mass urbanization, but also decay happening at the same time. So poverty going on there, and you had a growing divide happening between the middle and the lower classes. But on the other hand, you also had people that were flourishing in this time period. So you had the yuppies, or the young, upwardly moving professionals. So these are like the boomers when they were younger. They were encouraged to flaunt their affluence through consumerism. So there was the general attitude that greed was good. So that was the general thing that was the environment that goth grew out of. In terms of the goth subculture specifically, so these formed the group that were kind of pushed into the fringes of society, and they were defined as other because they were deviant from the general population in terms of their attitude and appearance. So they were heavily influenced by the punk movement, which was a previous movement mostly growing within the 1970s. But they were starting to move a bit away from punk, so they were a bit less angry and politically motivated, and they were a bit more angsty, a bit more introspective. It's almost like instead of being angry at the political climate, they were kind of having a existential crisis on a personal level. So the goth movement was part of the post-punk movement, which generally means that people like bands were looking for new looks and new sounds, and this goth was the term that was that the media used to give to these bands, that they sounded darker, they had romantic and morbid influences in their lyrics and sound. And generally music was a huge influence on the goth subculture. So there are a couple of major bands circulating at this time, but the two main ones are Susie and the Banshees and Bauhaus. They were considered the grandparents of goth, both sonically and also in terms of their fashion aesthetic. The Batcave. So during this time, the concept of clubs, like nightclubs, They was on the rise. So the Batcave was like a goth specific one, and this has served as a sort of social sanctuary gathering place for people in the goth subculture to congregate and listen to their favorite music and feel like they were part of the community and not being judged. So as you can see by these photos, the goths had a very distinctive look as well that was influenced by the appearance of the popular goth bands at the time. So you had like the glam rock, eye makeup and hair. You had really pale complexion. You generally had materials like leather and lace, PVC, fishnet stockings, Doc Marten boots, band shirts, and obviously stereotypically predominantly black. Okay, so moving on, just to recap my part A. So during part A, I gathered lots of props and costume parts, and I also scouted for locations. And at the time, this was a bit limited because of the COVID-19 situation, so I just had to make do with my backyard and just hypothetically think of locations. And then in the backyard, I did a photo shoot there, and with in mind the fact that I was going to remove the backgrounds for later Photoshop experimentation. So as you can see, I've got my 3 favorite photos from this shoot, and then underneath them you have the ways that I manipulated them in Photoshop. My favorite one out of these was the Death by Fright. Like, that's like a fake band that I just made up for the purposes of this, and I made like a fake band poster. So I really enjoyed doing that one, and I was hoping to carry that on in some way in part B. So the issues that I encountered during this process was like generally just how I would go about doing things, especially like the sourcing props and costumes, considering like the COVID-19 situation again, and essentially that whole thing made it easy for me to pick goth as what I would represent for the Tableau Vivant, because I personally identify with the style myself. So I've got a lot of props and costume items lying around already that I could substitute in a pinch. So yeah, it was easy for me to pick that, and it just made sense. One thing that I noted from this photo shoot is that obviously I needed a better camera, and I needed more like neutral backgrounds, so a bit less grass around the feet and causing green reflection on the black areas made it a bit difficult for me to remove the backgrounds at the end. So those are 2 things I kept in mind for part B. So this is just a mood board. So from part A, like part A was mostly a mood board that was me trying to just get the general feel of 80s goth. And for this one, I try and specifically zoom in on 3 particular stylistic influences that I wanted to carry over into part B. So Susie Sue was one, Patricia Morrison as well with the guitar, and also band posters. You can see several types of goth bands here. And I just really like the aesthetic of those, so I just thought I'd collect more visual reference for them. Then we have my costume and props. So this illustration here, I incorporated into part A, which I'll just recap over briefly. So obviously you have all the costume elements that I tried to illustrate there. So like, the hair, the eye makeup, the different accessories and whatnot. And then underneath that, the specific props that I thought would be like symbolically relevant to like indicate, yes, that this was the 80s and this was goth. So, you got your Ankh necklace. Like the goths incorporate a lot of spiritual symbolism in their accessories. The skull, obviously, identifiable with goth because of their morbid interests. A cigarette, I don't smoke personally, but in the 80s it was fashionable, so I resorted that I would have to either borrow one or like Photoshop it in. And also the music influences, so you got your record, your cassette, and also a guitar as well. And on the left of the slide here, you've got all the props that I had on the day. So I had a ceramic skull lying around, and then you have a leather jacket, a long, like sheer black shirt, a long skirt, some jewelry, pointed leather shoes. Very important that they're pointed as well. some cuff jewelry, a belt, a band shirt, which I specially ordered in, Susie and the Banshees vintage band shirt, a dragon head ring, and also my bass guitar because I play bass, which is another reason why I picked Patricia Morrison as an influence, because I just identified with that. So I had a bass guitar lying around. Makeup and hair. So obviously I tried to draw off my main influence, which was Susie Sue. So because she was like considered a huge influence on the makeup look of like every goth in the 80s. So the main features that I wanted to like just go over briefly here, because not everyone's into makeup, but just generally, if you want to look goth, go 2-3 shades paler than you usually would, or if you're pale, then good for you. You don't have to buy a completely different foundation to the one you usually use. Use like a slanted or pointed small brush to like outline those eyebrows, make them really pointy and like almost Egyptian-like in their details as well. And you can shade that in with black eyeshadow or eyeliner. And then you can also add more detail to the eyes, so put darker eyeshadow colors and do like a really pointed cat's eye, like really emphasize that. And then the thing that took me longest was the hair, because I have a lot of hair and you have to tease it all up, you can back comb it. It becomes like a big bird's nest, really, and by the end you should have enough texture and volume from hairspray and like dry shampoo and hair wax, along with the teasing, that you should be able to just pin it up without any elastics. And the worst part of that was trying to get it out later. Cue me sitting there with a head full of hair conditioner for an hour. That's the only thing that would work. Anyway, so then we're moving on to location. So this is a location that I wanted to go to on the day, and it was close by my house, so I wouldn't get in trouble from moving out of my postcode. And also, I thought this location was very appropriate because St. John's Anglican Church, it's a heritage listed site, and it has over 900 grave sites that date all the way back to the 1800s. So I thought that this location would be great for mood lighting, and I had in the background of all my photos, you had plenty of really old looking weathered headstones. And these are the kinds of headstones, because obviously it has a British colonial influence dating all the way back from the 1800s in Australia, colonial history there. These are the kinds of cemeteries that you would find all over Britain as well. So these are the kinds of places that you'd find a 80s goth individual loitering, trying to take really edgy photos. So these are some of my favorites from the photo shoot that day. So obviously I took a lot more, I went inside for the photo shoot for one half of it, because you had the white walls there, made it easier for me to, well, I was hoping it would make it easier for me to remove myself from those backgrounds in case I needed to. And then we have a few really good shots from the cemetery as well. There were a few like complications there, which I'll go further into, but yeah, it was really fun to shoot there on the day. I only encountered one person who was who interrupted my photo shoot and gave me a really, really funny look, but didn't approach me, so that was fine. But I left quite quickly after that anyway, so yeah. Okay, so these are some of the photos that I experimented with in Photoshop. So in part A, I used like maybe 2 tutorials from YouTube to help me try and figure out how to apply, different effects, like through level adjustment and, the curves, and also like adjusting the RGB spectrum and applying different like filters and different blending modes and applying texture overlays and stuff. So I had a little bit of experience with that, but I wanted to broaden that for part B. So I looked up like maybe 6 more tutorials and tried to experiment a little bit with each photo. Eventually what ended up happening is that if I learnt something from one video, I might have taken it to another photo and combined it with another tutorial as well. So it was all very intuitive by the end. So here I tried to simulate vintage effects. I wanted to try and make it look like that my photos were aged and they originated from the 80s. Like they were in some sort of shoebox underneath someone's bed or on top of someone's cupboard. But yeah, so I applied like different paper and grainy textures, and I also used blur, Gaussian blur, and pointillize as well, and in the bottom right hand one. And I made it kind of look like it was a Polaroid photo, which I think is period appropriate. And then in the bottom right hand one, I tried to incorporate some light bleed, like it was taken with an old camera lens. I also, in those two photos I just mentioned, also tried to put a date stamp to try and give it that authentic period look as well. So those were very fun to experiment with. So this is the final picture I decided to go with to fully express the tableau vivant in terms of 80s goth subculture. So this photo, not really, more like a compilation of elements. It's a homage to post-punk goth rock music. And one could argue that without the music, goth wouldn't have even left the ground as a subculture. It was so important to the identity and aesthetic of the whole community that I thought it was very appropriate that I should try and simulate a poster from that looks like one of the beloved bands from that period. So as you can see, this look is very similar to one of my earlier prototypes, but I incorporated a lot of what I learned in this investigation for part B, a lot of new techniques, and if you look at them side by side, it really shows that the progression, I think, very strongly in what I learnt in this part of the assignment. So yeah. Moving on to rationale for this final photo, or series of photos if I include the experiments, and also a reflection generally on part B of the tableau vivant. So I believe that the photos that I've experimented with, and especially my final one, I think they represent the 80s goth subculture in three key ways. So in several of the photos you see graffiti and grungy looking alleyways, and I think that kind of represents a sense of urban decay that was just the everyday life for the social minorities of the time. Like this is where they lived. They were surrounded in urban decay. Also with the cemetery, your sense of the morbid and macabre interests that preoccupied the Goths. That the darker interest there, I feel like, is represented very well by the cemetery. We're all going to end up there. So, and also through my band poster, the significance, again, of the music scene and of band culture, and especially those, key bands, like especially Susie Sue. The band poster for Susie Sue is the one that I particularly tried to appropriate for the final tableau vivant. So besides the subject matter, I also feel like I embodied the 80s very well in the effects that I tried to apply to my photos to age them as if they, so that they would look like as if they came from the period. And I also think that in my process I resolved a concern of mine that I had early on, that because the goth movement and the punk movement were adjacent to each other, like one very much influenced the other, I was worried that it might be difficult to tell the difference between them. But I found that wasn't really an issue once I started really setting up my photos, because the general attitude and aesthetic of goth is you can see the cross applicability there in terms of appearance, but the general attitude was completely different. And I feel like you can see that especially in the subject matter that I choose to depict in my photos. So there were a couple of issues I also encountered that I will mention in my final photo shoot. So even though I use a more professional quality camera, I think I use a Canon series of letters and numbers, just a Canon camera. But even though I use that, the photos still weren't the quality that I wanted. I don't know if that's something to do with settings, but my photography skills aren't really the greatest. So, I had that limitation. There are also a few missing items I forgot, or the ones that didn't arrive on time. I tried to order some props and costume items that might make my costume a bit more time accurate, period accurate, sorry. But they didn't end up arriving on time, again, probably due to COVID-19 interfering with international shipping. But yeah, I didn't have a few key items, but I feel like at the end didn't really matter because you still get the overall goth vibe anyway. And on the day of the shoot, conditions weren't ideal and I had to kind of work around that. So, like, the makeup and hair takes a very long time. It took me about 2 hours to put all of it on. And then by that time, there was like weather issues and that changed the lighting and stuff. So, not to mention when I was at the cemetery, I was being eaten alive by mosquitoes. So, and also too, I wasted a lot of time shooting and then realized that I was wearing my glasses. It's funny how you don't really notice that until you look back on the photos and you're like, darn, I wasn't supposed to have those on. And then I had to retake everything. But yeah, so those are some of the small issues I encountered that I had to progress through in finishing part B. And just to draw some conclusions, I'd like to leave on a quote from Peter Murphy, who was the frontman of Bauhaus, one of the key goth rock bands. And he said, "The goths are beautiful, a vast depth of subcultural, aesthetic, and poetic ideas, but not the postmodern distortion, the costume without the brain." So I thought I would reflect on this in my conclusion, this statement, because there is an issue in the contemporary goth community right now. It's like a sense of elitism almost, where people who were the traditional goths, these old school goths, got into the movement when they're in their 20s or so. And now they're in their 60s. And for those who are still part of the lifestyle of goth, they feel like these new members of the community, these baby bats, as they are sometimes called, these new goths, these younger people, they appropriate the goth culture as a fashion statement without truly understanding or appreciating where it's coming from. So, those people who like to wear fishnet stockings or whatever, they just think it looks cool and they don't really have any appreciation for the music, which is what the goth movement, essentially was all about. So there's like a divide within the community. But I feel like by doing this assignment and investigating the origins of the goth community, which I feel like I personally identify with, it really helped me gain a more informed and personal understanding and connection with the movement. So by being able to step into the shoes of an 80s goth, even just temporarily, it really made me appreciate that, it's not just a shallow aesthetic statement like, oh, look how cool I am in this getup, but you're part of a community and you're representing the community through your clothing and your music taste and your attitude and interests. And you're also a part of history. This movement is still alive and kicking. It's just evolving in many different ways. And who knows where it'll go in the future, but it'll be important, I think, to remember how it all started. Anyway, So just a few references there, just ticking all my boxes. And yeah, that's the end. Thank you for listening.